Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 9, The One Who Went First. Science fiction, fantasy, time travel. This is the Stories Told podcast, talking about worlds of stories told, from movies to TV shows and, of course, books. I am E.W. Barnes, fiction author and avid fan of great stories. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds, thousands of stories told. Let's begin. Want to vote on what we talk about next? In the show notes below, there's a link to a private Facebook group where I have posted a poll. You can choose one of the options listed or offer a suggestion of your own. Today we're talking about one of my favorite episodes in the first season of Stargate SG1, which is currently available for streaming on Netflix, but only until the end of November, and it is also streaming on Amazon. And as you know by now, beyond here there will be spoilers, so if you have not already seen the show and don't want to know what's going to happen, now's the time to click over to one of those snowy forest videos. My favorite episode in the first season of Stargate SG1 is called The Torment of Tantalus. The story is about Daniel Jackson discovering that the Stargate had been opened before by the U.S. government in 1945, and that a man had gone through. Jackson discovers that the man who went through was Ernest Littlefield, the fiancé of Catherine Langford, the woman who was instrumental in reopening the Stargate when Jackson and O'Neill went through to the planet Abydos. And that's the story that's the subject of the movie Stargate, on which the series is based. Jackson convinces General Hammond to send a team to the coordinates that Littlefield had traveled to. They arrive in an elaborate sea cliff palace that appears derelict and abandoned, and they discover that Littlefield is still alive. They promise to take him home, only to discover that the DHD, or dial home device, has been damaged and no longer works. While Captain Carter tries to fix the DHD, Littlefield shows them the amazing things that he has discovered in the palace, including a book left by advanced species. Jackson is fascinated by the book, and even when Carter finds a way to power the Stargate with lightning from an approaching storm, Jackson refuses to leave, desiring only to study the book, even if it means risking being stranded there. It's not until Littlefield points out that there's no point in learning if it can't be shared with someone else that Jackson relents, and they escape just as the palace is crumbling into the sea. Here's what I liked about this episode. I like the history of the Stargate. We know from the movie that the Stargate was uncovered in a dig near Giza in 1929, and then doesn't get opened successfully until the late 80s, early 90s. But here we have evidence that the Stargate was actually opened in 1945, that the U.S. government tried to do something with it decades before the events that took place in Stargate the movie. And I love that sort of reality that, of course, the government would have tried to do something with it instead of just leaving it in a packing crate for decades. I really enjoyed that element, giving the entire series a little bit more depth. I also liked the mystery of the palace. It was beautifully done, both with painting and with sets, and it really gave a level of, again, depth and culture related to how the Stargates worked and how they were used by other species. It was something that I really wanted to dig into more, even though this episode didn't have very much time to do that. I also really enjoyed the human element between Jackson and Littlefield, both of them being very similar personalities. People who like to learn, people who want to explore, people who want to learn more, but Littlefield having the benefit of experience that he could share with Jackson, which ultimately saved his life. And then structurally, I really enjoyed this episode because it starts off in one way. We're in Stargate Command, we're doing this history research, and the next thing you know, we're in this fabulous palace with an entirely different storyline. Ernest Littlefield at the beginning, and the storyline of how are they going to escape from this planet at the end. What do I wish was different about this episode? There was no follow-up with Littlefield throughout the entire series. There were no references to him serving as a consultant, for example, or assisting with the notes that he took while he was stranded there. He kind of just disappeared. There was 1 or 2 references about him on Ernest's planet, or that he was reunited with Catherine Langford. But other than that, we didn't really hear about him. I also wish there had been some follow-up with the palace, especially after the Stargate team got space travel access. We never saw another place quite like it, and there was never any reference to going back there and studying what had been found, or at least trying to recover anything that had fallen into the sea. So while this is my favorite episode of the first season, there are a couple of runners-up. Another episode I really enjoyed in this season was called Solitudes. I enjoyed this episode because it showed us the team being separated and how they worked independently to try to save each other and come back together. In this story, the team is trying to escape from bad guys, and there's an electrical discharge which sends Jackson and Teal'c through to Stargate Command, and Carter and O'Neill through to a desolated ice location. And Carter can't seem to get that Stargate to work. And what we find out later is the reason it doesn't work is because it's actually another Stargate on Earth. And what do you do when you try to call your own telephone number? You get a busy signal. So she couldn't dial back to Earth because she was dialing from Earth to Earth. I really like this episode because there's good character development. We get to see Carter, who is usually a genius, trying and failing and not figuring out why this isn't working. And we see Jackson succeed in figuring out what's going on in a realm that isn't usually his bailiwick. He's usually not the tech guy. He's the history guy. But he figured out the tech solution that Carter couldn't figure out. Plus, it laid the groundwork with this second gate on Earth for some really interesting storylines in the future. Another episode I really enjoyed from first season is called Thor's Hammer. And it was a really wonderful story about how when the Goa'uld, who are the enemies in this time of the storyline in Stargate, come to a particular planet, Thor's people, who is a race known as the Asgard, had developed a device which would send any person with the Goa'uld creature within them, which is a parasitic kind of gross creature, if you haven't already seen the series. They would send them to this special place, which would essentially enable them to be free of the Goa'uld creature. So the host could go through this special place, it would kill the creature as they escaped, which would be very painful, but then they would be free of this parasite. The problem is that as soon as the team arrives, Teal'c, who has one of these Goa'uld creatures in him, because he's serving as an incubator rather than a host, and that's part of his biology, so it's inseparable from him, he is sent to this place, along with O'Neill, who tries to save him. And so they're faced with the choice that if he walks through this device that's going to kill his parasite, it will kill him too, because he's not a host, he's essentially an incubator. And he volunteers to stay behind, and O'Neill says, no, that's not going to happen. And so we're seeing how even this wonderful tool that the Asgard created wasn't created for this unique circumstance of Teal'c not being a host and needing to keep the parasite even though he was no longer serving the Goa'uld. So I really enjoyed that as well. We got to see a little bit of the Asgard technology, we got to see a little bit of the Asgard culture, and we got to see this really important decision that had to be made in order to save Teal'c. Back to the Torment of Tantalus. On a scale of 1 to 10, I give that episode a 9. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and vote in the poll on the Facebook group. And join me next time when we talk about one of my favorite episodes from Season 2 of Stargate SG1. See you then.